Nationalism and Patriotism. A Tale of Two Ideals, Multiculturalism, and the Path to Prosperity. In a world increasingly defined by cultural diversity and interdependence, the tension between nationalism and patriotism remains at the forefront of political discourse. While both concepts invoke a deep connection to one's country, their implications for society, and their influence on the global economy, are dramatically different. Adding to this, the interplay of religious tolerance, multiculturalism, and political freedom further shapes the outcomes of these ideals, either fostering prosperity and cooperation or creating division and discord. At the heart of these divergent paths lies a fundamental question: what does it mean to love one's country? And how do the values of religious pluralism, economic freedom, and multiculturalism intertwine with this love to promote lasting prosperity? The historical roots of nationalism and patriotism. The origins of nationalism date back to the late 18th century, emerging during Europe's Enlightenment as a political force that sought to unite people around a common language, culture, and identity. Nationalist movements were a reaction to centuries of imperial rule, where large, multi-ethnic empires often suppressed local identities. Thinkers like Johann Gottfried Herder believed each nation had a unique cultural essence, an idea that would eventually shape European nation-states. Patriotism, however, has a longer history. It is rooted in the idea of loyalty to the values and principles that define a country rather than a specific ethnic or cultural identity. The American Revolution exemplifies this form of patriotism, where the colonists' struggle for independence wasn't about racial or religious supremacy but about the principles of self-governance, freedom, and equality. In this context, patriotism evolved to embrace diversity, uniting people of different backgrounds under a common cause. Nationalism versus patriotism, the cultural divergence. Though nationalism and patriotism are both expressions of attachment to one's homeland, the differing emphasis leads to profoundly different cultural outcomes. Nationalism, in its modern form, often promotes exclusion. It enforces rigid cultural boundaries, asserting that the nation's strength lies in its ethnic, religious, or cultural purity. This can lead to xenophobia, religious intolerance, and an aversion to multiculturalism. When nationalism becomes the dominant force, societies tend to turn inward, erecting barriers to cultural exchange and suppressing religious and ethnic differences. This exclusionary mindset can quickly evolve into policies that limit individual freedoms, with economic consequences that stifle growth and innovation. Patriotism, by contrast, encourages inclusion. It recognizes that the strength of a nation lies not in its homogeneity but in its diversity. In countries like the United States, Canada, and India, patriotism has fostered a sense of unity amidst diversity, where different cultures, religions, and ethnicities coexist and contribute to a broader national identity. This kind of patriotism embraces religious tolerance and multiculturalism, encouraging open dialogue and mutual respect. It is in this inclusive vision that we see the seeds of lasting prosperity. Religious tolerance and multiculturalism, the pillars of a flourishing society. History has shown time and again that societies which embrace religious tolerance and cultural diversity are more likely to thrive. One of the clearest examples of this is the Islamic Golden Age, during which the Muslim world became a beacon of intellectual and economic achievement. Scholars from diverse religious backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others, worked together in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, exchanging ideas that advanced science, mathematics, and philosophy. This era of cultural and religious cooperation allowed the economy to flourish, as innovation and trade flowed freely across borders. In contrast, societies that embrace a nationalist agenda, often at the expense of religious tolerance, tend to isolate themselves, both culturally and economically. Europe's bloody 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, largely driven by religious intolerance between Protestant and Catholic states, devastated the continent's economy and fractured societies. Similarly, modern nationalist movements that promote religious exclusivity, such as those seen in Myanmar or India's more extreme political factions, can sow division, destabilizing the economy and threatening social harmony. In multicultural societies, religious tolerance is more than a moral virtue, it's an economic asset. The United States, with its long history of immigration and cultural diversity, has repeatedly demonstrated how inclusion leads to innovation. Silicon Valley, often referred to as the engine of the modern economy, has thrived because it is a melting pot of ideas and talents from across the world. Tech companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft were founded by, or currently led by, immigrants or the children of immigrants. This dynamic cultural exchange is a direct product of a patriotic, rather than a nationalist, vision, one that welcomes diversity as a source of strength. Political freedom and economic prosperity. Political freedom is intimately tied to economic prosperity. Nationalism, which often favors authoritarian governance to enforce cultural or religious homogeneity, restricts individual freedoms and, by extension, economic opportunities. When the state controls the economy or limits freedoms in the name of national unity, innovation suffers. North Korea, one of the most nationalist regimes in the world, is a stark example of how the suppression of political freedom can lead to economic collapse. Isolated from the global economy, and driven by an extreme nationalist ideology, North Korea's population faces poverty and oppression. Patriotism, on the other hand, values political freedom as the cornerstone of a strong and prosperous nation. Democratic countries that uphold the rule of law and protect individual rights often have the freest and most dynamic economies. Freedom fosters creativity and entrepreneurship, leading to greater economic output and higher standards of living. The post-war economic miracle in Japan, Germany, and South Korea illustrates how political freedoms, when coupled with patriotic values, can lead to astonishing growth. Japan's recovery after World War II was rooted in a patriotic commitment to democratic reforms and economic openness. While nationalism in pre-war Japan had led to militarism and economic disaster, post-war patriotism, focused on rebuilding the nation's economy and promoting democracy, turned Japan into a global economic powerhouse. Similarly, South Korea's rise from poverty to prosperity was driven by its investment in education, technology, and global trade, all underpinned by patriotic pride in its post-war achievements. Nationalism, patriotism, and common sense, a path forward. In today's globalized world, the distinction between nationalism and patriotism has never been more critical. Nationalist policies that close borders, limit cultural exchange, and prioritize exclusion over inclusion ultimately undermine the prosperity of a nation. Economies that rely on openness, innovation, and cooperation are far more resilient in the long run. Patriotism, rooted in common sense, promotes a vision of unity through diversity. It acknowledges that the prosperity of a nation depends not just on its citizens' loyalty, but on their freedom to express different religious beliefs, cultural traditions, and political opinions. This type of patriotic inclusiveness fosters cooperation, strengthens social cohesion, and encourages economic growth. Moreover, political freedom, the very foundation of democracy, plays a vital role in maintaining a stable and prosperous society. Nations that uphold individual rights, religious tolerance, and multiculturalism create fertile ground for economic innovation and success. By embracing these values, patriotic nations remain competitive in the global economy, thriving through their ability to attract talent, investment, and ideas from around the world. Conclusion: the inclusive future of patriotism. Nationalism and patriotism offer two distinct paths for nations. Nationalism, with its focus on exclusion and cultural homogeneity, leads to division, economic stagnation, and isolation. Patriotism, which embraces religion